so thank you for inviting Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs to this very interesting seminar, to this very interesting topic. I think from the point of Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs, we fully agree with what you said, and we think that the only way to decrease homelessness in the Czech Republic, to decrease number of people who have problems with housing, is just to do better housing policies, not to put people into shelters or other social services, but as soon as they are prepared or they overcome the crisis situation, they should use the flats with the social work support if they need it. So in this regard we fully agree, but still I think we in the Czech Republic we miss or we do not have a social agreement on the way how to solve homelessness. So still we are not discussing about the ways and tools how to decrease the number of people in crisis or in the housing problems, but we are discussing if it is or it is not a problem, if we should do something on the social housing and affordable housing or not. So unfortunately we are discussing like 4 years, 5 years very intensively if we have a problem or we do not have a problem. Unfortunately, I think that the social contract in the Czech Republic is based on the idea that people who are excluded from housing and people living or homeless people, so they deserve to be excluded from the social housing. So sometimes Czech politicians and also Czech public takes it as a normal that these people are in hostels, they are in shelters, they are on the street, and they know it's more expensive than when they live in flats, when they have appropriate social support when they need it. So that's the problem. Czech society, I think, unfortunately, still thinks that it's better to pay more money and not to solve the problem. So I think we need to find a way how to solve this problem and how to prepare better discussion about homelessness or decreasing the number of people in a homeless situation and people who have housing problems. I think it is also important to experts, to organizations, to individuals, to academy and public administration to have, also the non-profit sector has many ideas how to solve this problem. And when we were preparing the Social Housing Act, so we had many disagreements also from non-profit sector, and I thought, and I still think, it was very ineffective, and it also helped to kill the previous Social Housing Act, because it's okay not to agree and to have a lot of rows, but we need to have them inside our offices and inside our buildings and seminars and sessions. But when we speak to politicians which are not keen on decreasing the number of homeless people, then we need to have more, we need more agreement on this topic. And I think we didn't find this agreement among the experts. And so I think it's a very important thing to change in the Czech society. And I think the public administration needs to solve the housing problem and the problem of homeless people as a problem of our system, of our social and housing system. And still we do not do that. So I think think it's a very big problem on the side of the public administration. That's all for me.
Okay, thank you. Dennis, do you want to respond, or shall we do the round first? Well, just a very brief note. I understand that in the second part of that contribution, we actually heard an invitation to increase cooperation, I think, and we want to keep it on the more general level of that sort of statement.
Okay, thank you for the speech and the opportunity to discuss our ideas with you. I would have one general observation and one specific note on the cluster analysis and one question to Professor Culhane. But before that, I would just shortly react to my colleague. It's true that we, as one of the representatives of NGO sector, we have a lot of ideas. We have, I guess, a lot of promising examples of good practices at a local level, and we hope that the government will be inspired, because we also have very good data about how effective it is. So we'll keep on with a lot of ideas. So now the general observation. It's really inspiring, despite all these like negative developments in the housing market and so on. It's very inspiring to hear that actually ending homelessness is possible, or at least a very substantial reduction in the number of chronic homelessness, for example. And it's great that we know what works, and also it's evident that for it work we need some national efforts, some national targets, some national programs, some clear framework, not that everybody is doing whatever they want, but really targeted effort, and which means basically, as I understood your story, it needs some like proper funding, like bigger volume of money, and also like channeling the funding where it really helps, and also some rearrangements of policy interventions. This is what I cannot see at present in Czech Republic. I cannot see the clear national target, clear framework, the data, and some like targeted efforts of the national and local governments. And now some specific comments about the patterns of shelter utilization. I think it's, when I first read the paper, I thought it was like really a revolution, so I was trying to see what data do we have, and it seemed like we have very basic data about the duration of stay in shelters, but very, very basic, and it is not, we don't know like what is the effectiveness of shelter exit, and what is most striking, even if we know some of the data, it seems like the policy intervention is not directed by the empirical results. So, for example, compared to your 3 clusters, we also have some kind of, chronic crisis and episodic shelter users. Recently, this summer, we calculated something like this for the city of Brno for like 12 different shelters. The numbers are a bit like, the proportions is a bit different. We have like only 10% who are like this crisis homelessness or shelter users. We have, where you have 90% of the people who are like crisis or episodic, we have only 50% now. And so the 50% are like long-term users. So the proportion is different, but definitely there is like different typology of users. And as far as I can see, we don't have like different policy interventions for the people. Although the providers would say we are dealing with people individually, but it basically means we are dealing with in like general rule. And as you said, we are lacking this kind of rapid reaction to the crisis situation. We are lacking this well-thought, well-devised and well-funded prevention rehousing programs. We are lacking like special jobs for the providers to really get people out of the shelters with some kind of social rental agencies and so on. I cannot see the variety of different like instruments for the prevention, although there are some very nice cases. For example, the municipality of Prague 7 or Liberec are devising some like coordinated entry system with like differentiated reactions or like interventions for like different needs of people have, and the shelter or the social housing is not like the first bit. It's so there is some local variations, but like the 99% would be very like undifferentiated. So this is where I see the transferability and the big inspiration. And the final is the question for you, and it would be regarding of course the big problem of the affordability crisis of the housing market. I see that it's not only the West Coast where the prices are going high, so even the East Coast, and I guess like our major cities do have the same kind of trend in the housing market. So what would be your recommendation or your reaction, or how this would influence the policy recommendations? Thank you.
Should I take that question now? Let me just briefly comment on that, and then because you've heard enough from me, we want to hear what the Czech voices have to say. But I would just say we definitely distinguish between affordable housing solutions and homelessness interventions, because the affordable housing problem is much bigger and it's much more costly to address. There's lots of great ideas. We have a lot of agreement in the United States on what needs to be done, but we're not doing it. But there is a lot of agreement on that. The homelessness system, I always use the analogy that we're like the emergency room of the healthcare system, the urgent care center of the health system. And we are trying to save people from imminent disaster, and that's what we can solve. We cannot solve, we don't make you exercise better or eat healthier and quit smoking and all that. The emergency room gives you stitches and gets your cast and stabilizes you, and that's what we can hope for from what we're doing. It's not to say that we shouldn't have a public health system that helps people quit smoking and exercise and eat better and all that, but it's not our domain, is what I would just say, just to distinguish.
Okay, my name is Martin Lux. I'm from Institute of Sociology, Academy of Sciences. We made some homelessness research. I will have two things that I liked very much from your presentation, and I will have two things that I think that the context is really different in Czech Republic than in US, and two questions, so everything will be twice. The first thing I really like most is the cost-benefit analysis that you did. I think the argument based on cost-benefit analysis is much better than just saying that people should have their own housing and they have a right for own housing. This really works in politics. If you show that it's much cheaper to find and rapidly find new housing than to provide social services and shelter, then it works much quickly to convince politicians to withdraw money for that purpose. I think it would be great if we have the same access to data as you had. We can do that in some way, but only in very qualitative way in some location, for example in Brno if they had their own projects, or we can do it in some special survey. But it's only qualitative, kind of research, which cannot be generalized, and we cannot do it really in more quantitative way, really to prove that it's cheaper and it's more effective. This is the argument that really works. The second thing what I really liked is this green box in your presentation, the mediator that works somewhere between landlord and tenant. This is very long time discussed in this country, also because we privatize most of the housing, so we do not have a lot of public housing. And most of rental housing is in private form, so it's private renting. So it's logical that the solution would be to use more private renting for the solving of homelessness. But for that purpose, we need definitely someone who mediates between tenant and landlord. There were many attempts to establish something like that, like social rental agency or guaranteed fund. All of them were unsuccessful. So this is really something that we should perhaps discuss why, because concerning the context, it should work. but there is no really political will to support such a mediation. Well, one reason may be that free markets or private landlords sometimes do not behave so nicely. Sometimes the rents are relatively high, sometimes even very high. They speculate with poverty. We call it sometimes speculation with poverty or business with poverty. So this may be the reason why there is a skepticism towards this way, but I think that this is the way forward. Now, where the context is different, I think the main difference to us is really, and it was mentioned, I think, by Vít already, that we have a lot of small municipalities. There is a 10 million of inhabitants and more than 6,000 of municipalities. And these small, fiscally weak and politically weak municipalities will not do very, expansive and politically risky policies like social housing. Housing is always very expensive and it's politically risky, because if you help poor people, those poor people who are also have other social problems, a lot of them are coming from jails and etc. If you help those people, you do not get political votes, instead you lose them. And if the municipality is small, then if you do such a policy, there is a danger that you will not win next elections. That's why I think in this situation, in this country, it's necessary that we have the law on social housing and a duty for municipalities to do such a policies, which is it's not very standard in other countries. But this country with such a high decentralization of power, I think needs it, otherwise it will be not solved any time. Even the motivation, as you mentioned, new money is not working. Even if there are new money coming from the state, these municipalities use them to accommodate key workers instead, or some money, pensioners, young families, and not really homeless people. That's why there was an attempt to create law, but again unsuccessful. And where also, some specific contextual features is that we made this kind of not quantitative but qualitative survey among homeless people. We followed their passes to homelessness. And we try to find out the nodes where their passes intersect. Not what is the reason, what is the major, cause, because they're very individual, but whether there are nodes where most of the passes intersect. And we found out that in this country, this node is what we call bad debt from consumption loan. That they are very indebted, and this indebtedness decreases their motivation to solve their situation, because if they solve it, the banks will always ask them, from new wage that they will get, to pay the debt. So, this huge indebtedness is really very specific contextual feature. Last two questions, it's relating to the municipalities, the problem with municipalities we have. How is exactly housing supported, social housing or supported housing that you mentioned, in US? In what way, really, what are the money, who pays for that, and what is the coverage? And I have a methodological question. You showed that there is a decrease in chronic homelessness, but it could be also by other factors. Did you control, the other factors?
Yes. So in terms of who pays for it, just briefly, the services are provided through healthcare dollars. So our healthcare system, which has public insurance for people who are low income, provides the support services to help people move into an apartment, be a good neighbor, get connected to the necessary health supports. The rent is paid for through a combination of a federal voucher that pays for a big chunk of it, and then the tenant has to put 1/3 of their income into the rent. And so that's how it gets paid for. But we're totally dependent on federal. Almost all of the money I just mentioned, by the way, is all federal. It's the federal housing subsidy, it's the federal disability benefit for cash, and the health benefit is 75% federal. So without federal leadership, it wouldn't happen. It's definitely not a local duty or solution kind of thing. In terms of the decline, I did, those were just from the aggregate reports from to the federal government. They were not statistically modeled results, so we're not adjusting for mortality, and we know that some of that is attributable to mortality, but as I said earlier, the declines are so much more significant than we would expect based on mortality. then, so we do think the programs are absolutely having the impact. But we did not model it in that way.
Thank you. I understand that some of you on the panel in the room may already have further questions. Please, could you keep them in your hand, and we'll finish the round, and then we'll go back to those questions. That's okay. So,
all right, I'll finish it up. First of all, to continue with my role of the representative of the host institution, there is a potentially homeless person in one of the paintings adoring the ceiling of this room. You don't have to turn your head and stand. And he's in front of the church. My physical isolation on the panel is very well representative of the real life situation, in that I'm distinctly less involved in the homelessness debate than any of the other panelists who present, Professor Culhane. I'm a labor economist, so I'm going to try to flip the standard speech I usually give about lack of data into the homelessness area. Yes, there is data from specific shelters or specific cities here and there. However, and there is this huge overlap of the homelessness issue with the indebtedness crisis that we have. So in the US, you have the opioid crisis, and we have hundreds of thousands, up to 1/10 of the population. We know much less than that, but anywhere in that region of people in this country who have these distress warrants or for feet. The bankers in the room can help me out with the preferred nomenclature, executive check, right? So people who are getting any of their labor income seized or their assets to some degree. So what we don't know is how many of these people there are who are actually working, but not officially, because there's the problem with the asset seizure or income, but also there's the problem that the way this country supports people, and including shelter and homeless, is that there are these benefits that also do get taken away the minute you start earning low level of labor income, right? So we might have hundreds of thousands of people working like that, in the white market or gray area. We just don't know. Why is it that we don't know? Well, as far as I know, there is no survey that would specifically target these types of demographic groups. That would specifically target the people in that are sheltered homeless, etc. And number two, and this is a general issue that has to do with the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, and it's that this is one of the few European countries where you simply cannot get a hold of data from the Social Security Administration. On my PC, I have anonymized large data sets from several European countries where I see people from the end of high school through apprenticeship programs, through every employment and sickness period, all the way to pension, and parental leaves, whatever. And in this country, after decades of modernizing our labor market administration, we cannot actually ask whether somebody has gone through some active labor market policy program, retraining, whatever, whether they're employed 2 years down the road. The share of the last 10 years that they've been working are not officially. It's just very basic questions that you need to perform any kind of evaluation of this type is impossible because nobody in the government, including the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, has been able to effectively push the Social Security Administration towards providing such data, which is the standard of civilized governing in any developed European country. And so until that actually happens, it's always going to be very easy, to avoid the issue because we don't have our data on it, and it's going to be very hard to devise proper response strategies. What we've heard from the examples from the US is that when you do have data, even in absence of randomized assignment to treatment, I'm sure all of you know this, but the golden standard of science is you have control groups and randomized treatment assignment, right? And we do that in social sciences, and there are examples of randomized assignment to housing first, and that Ethan and Štěpán are responsible for it in Brno, and those are the golden standard of science. However, they can usually be performed on small samples and select locations and so on. However, in social sciences, for decades and decades, you can buy wonderful books on how we define causality, popular science books. we have been devising methods how to get as close as possible to this golden standard of science, to finding out which programs work, which active labor market policy work, which rehousing program or subsidy program may or not work, help people, by finding quasi-random sources of allocation. So, for example, you mentioned your matching strategy and evaluation of the VA program, where you find veterans who were able to access the program, and you match them with veterans that look observationally as similar as possible, people with similar histories, with similar current status. And you kind of say, well, by now we've controlled for so many factors that the fact that one of them receives training, the other one doesn't, should be close to random. Even better, there's situations, I think Jim Sullivan has this Chicago study where depending on the day when you call in,
Yes.
to get, the supply of supportive housing varies from day to day, and you don't know that when you call it, right? So the probability that you will actually receive supportive housing does vary for perfectly random reasons. And you can use situations like that, you can do it in this country, how to actually get as close as possible to what you would get in a randomized control trial, and then you actually know what works. Once you know what works, and once you establish that in a simple, transparent fashion, like the one I just described, it's easier to communicate this with politicians. It's easier to spend the funding that you actually do obtain for this pressing, issue, and easy it is to explain to the general public. So we have made basically next to no progress on the evaluation of active labor market policies or housing policies, as far as I can tell, over the last couple of decades. There have been long projects on digitization of the Social Security data. You could take an anonymized server and put together the benefits and the contributions database to form the kind of data that could be used by social scientists for these purposes. But as far as I can tell, that has not happened yet, and so we don't know what active labor market policy works, and we will probably not know what housing policy works, and we'll not know that for years to come, unless the the new Minister of Labor and Social Affairs find some ingenuine way of pushing the Social Security Administration into actually acting the way a European Social Security Administration acts.
I think that was the end of your contribution.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Now, it may be a good idea to give the space to Dennis if he chooses to use it to reflect on what's...
You've heard a lot, I'm talking from a U.S. perspective, and certainly it's not generally applicable beyond there. But I would second the point that was just made, that having access to the administrative records and the linkage of them across these domains enables you to do evaluation and strategic planning much more quickly and on a national scale, and really is worth investing in finding the solution. And we can chat about that.
Okay, thank you. In that case, I will do what I said I will do, and that is give the space to our panelists to react to what their colleagues or Dennis or anyone else has said so far. I think both Linda and Beat wanted to have one or two words. And then, if there are no other raised hands from the panel, we will turn over to the audience and open the floor for further questions, if that's okay.
I understand your problems with data and statistics in the Czech Republic, but I'm not so data and research optimistic, because I think we have really enough of evidence. Research evidence, we have enough evidence from the programs. We know what works, and what works only in certain conditions, maybe what are the conditions, because not only Brno, but other municipalities in the Czech Republic, like Ostrava, small municipalities have their own researches and analysis on the topic, and they have data. Czech state doesn't have data on like the shelters or homeless people in shelters and so on. These data are in hands of the social services providers, and they have them. Maybe 2 years we discuss how to collect these data and analyze them, and the biggest problem on the side of the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs is procurement, how can we do it properly to meet the legal criteria, and what budget we can use for it. So it's quite a big problem on our side, and so Czech providers have data, like the biggest providers like the Salvation Army and other ones have data. They have very detailed data, and I think maybe if academies are interested in that, so maybe we could do some project, because we know there are projects on researches and statistics. So maybe we could make some effort and solve this problem. But still, we know it's very difficult problem. Professor Prudký, he always wants us to solve this and to make some analysis of their data. So, and I think that we had the local elections this weekend, and we know right now that not all municipalities who focused on social housing or the coalitions who focused on social housing ended, and some of them, of course, they have some problems, but we cooperate with 16 municipalities in our project on Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs, and we know that in a lot of them the efforts will continue, and maybe with the same coalitions. So it is not true that everyone who focuses on social housing and on support for vulnerable people needs to end the next election. So I think it's quite positive message.
Thank you.
Okay, I would just add something on to this data availability and usability discussion, and then have two comments to Martin Luke's remarks. So on the data part, it would be great to have this integrated database to see the results, because I don't think that we really know what works, because there are many policies all around the country in many municipalities that continue the same mistakes that we would think that everybody should know that it doesn't work. So like this transitional housing in Kadaň and other places. So it doesn't seem that it really, that the people have this consensus about what works or not. But I think it would be great to start with very basic data. We as the country or the government, we don't know the basic data. For example, in the discussion about the Social Housing Act or about the revised strategy for social housing, we don't even have the baseline data about how many homeless households or homeless people there are, or how many children there are in private hostels. We don't have the very basic yearly inflows to homelessness. We don't have the very basic. So, I'm not like really reaching for like this integrated database, even though it would certainly help. But I'm convinced that if we don't have the very basic data, and then the second step, we are not really using the data. There are some data we have, for example, the structure of the shelters, or even like how many families there are in like shelters and private hostels, but not the government, nor the municipalities use the data. Wherever our platform for social housing cooperates with the municipality or the NGO, we first ask them, so how many people there are who need this help, who are in housing need? They don't know, never ever. Even the service providers, even the government. They know the isolated providers-based databases, but they don't have the local system data. So we start with the data, with local system data to combine the common ground, so that we can then build on with this integrated approach. So first thing, we need the basic data. Then there is some bridge to Martin Luke's about the cost-benefit analysis of the data. In Brno, we have now released very fresh data about the cost-benefit, and it's not qualitative. It's based on this RCT, randomized control trial. We have the treatment and the control group. We have the data from labor office databases. We have the data from the hospital costs and so on. And maybe prematurely, but there should be some separate event, but I can say that there is, okay, it's representative only to homeless families in Brno, but the whole census of homeless families in Brno, and we can save 200,000 crowns per year per every family which gets from homelessness to housing with very intensive individualized support. So the main three sources of the savings are reduced shelter costs, then hospitalization, and then the child care, the institutional or the foster care of children. So these are the three main sources of the savings. There are others like ambulance and so on. So we know that we can save for every family 200,000 per year, and I don't believe it would be very significantly different in other cities. It might change a bit, but there is the costs come from national budgets. So the hospitals and the shelters and so on are run or funded by the government's funding, and the costs are very similar. So this is the second point, and then the last one about the indebtedness and the whole indebtedness threat, which is really affecting and overlapping with the homelessness crisis. It's certainly true, but I think it is not true that we have to solve indebtedness to solve the homelessness crisis. So we have pilots, and we can show that we can end homelessness of any individual or household, regarding if the household or the individuals in the household are indebted or not. They can be housed, they can be stably housed with supported service and so on. They can improve their health conditions, their family conditions and everything. There might probably, before we change legislation, they might be still indebted, but they will not be homeless. So I think it is crucial to know that, because every time we talk about the social housing bill and so on, and the social housing and reducing homelessness, everybody is talking about, okay, but there is this big problem. But of course, there is a big problem, and we don't need to stop solving homelessness before solving this big problem of indebtedness, according to my opinion. And the data from Brno, for example.
Thank you, Lesák. Now, Štěpán.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. So in general, it's very hard to know what works. And certainly there is a lot of descriptive research that describes the programs as they operate, that provides some basic understanding of how many people collect social assistance for people in poverty and so on. Now, but in general, it's the reason when you go to see a medical doctor and they prescribe some pill for you, it's not based on their experience, and there's a very good reason for that. If you go back in time, there used to be this hormonal replacement therapy. It was super popular. Women loved it, the doctors loved it, everybody loved it, and then you run a couple of RCTs, and it actually killed about 100,000 women plus, right, for heart attacks that you get from hormonal replacement therapy. Now, when you have retraining programs for unemployed, as we do in this country, you don't know how they work until you run some kind of either an RCT or use some quasi-experimental variation in who gets to go through a training session and who does not. And if you just look at who gets hired at the end of a training program, that does not answer the question of what would have happened if these people were not provided with the retraining support. It simply does not. There are decades of evidence this should be taught in high schools in terms of the approach. And it should be part of the basic understanding of how to deal with. Now, in active labor market policy, we have relied in the last years on Operation Program funding, European structural funds. That's going to run out. We don't know which of these programs to cut because they don't work, which of them to keep. When Germany ran through the Hartz IV reforms, and they actually implemented these kinds of evaluation on a large scale, starting with legislation that made data always available as a matter of principle. There will always have to be data anonymized and made available for research purposes. Right? And what they did is, out of the 15 billion euros that they were spending on retraining programs on active labor market policy, about a third of these programs did not help anybody. They were not corrupt, there were real sessions, there were real programs, but it was like a headache pill that actually did not help you with the headache. So we do desperately need that. And the reason we need administrative data is that it can help with both providing the basic evidence on, well, how many people in financial distress warrants we have who used to work, who used to contribute, Social Security contribution, and who suddenly disappeared, especially in municipalities where we know that there is a lot of financial distress, right? Because we do have municipality level data on financial distress warrants. It's just never been combined with the administrative data on Social Security contributions. It's the most basic thing if you want to know where the problem is, how many thousands of people are actually working on the black market, and if you want to estimate the overlap with the homelessness problem. So for both answering what works and for knowing the scale of the issue, it's going to be very hard and expensive, and also in terms of convincing people. I mean, if you talk to politicians, they'll say, well, how many hundreds of thousands of people are involved in this problem? And it's going to be hard to provide that kind of an answer, and the cost-benefit analysis that you do get at the end of an RCT, or that you would get at the end of a quasi-experimental evaluation of administrative data.
Thank you. Okay, well, Martin?
Shortly.
Would you like to have a short comment?
Very shortly, only again reactions. Still, I think it's better than if you have national data and you can verify your conclusions you have from Brno on really national data sets, than just coming, and even if this is analysis is done by, for example, Economic Institute, then by you, because you were the leaders of the project. So even, the way how it's computed, who is doing the analysis, and where the data are from are really significant for doing really proper conclusions from any projects. Concerning that not all municipalities, not all politicians who supported poor were not elected in these elections. Well, in fact, it depends who was selected as a poor. There are poor people and very poor people. I mean, for these projects that ministry is operating, the target group is relatively quite wide. So it could be also seniors, it could be also young people, not very good people like homeless people living in asylum housing.
I think in Ostrava they will have the same government or very similar. So and they really face very strong problems. And Ostrava is right the city which deals with the problem of very poor people, and maybe it can be with other cities which maybe have more political problems than Ostrava, but still.
No, I still think that if you look at it again, do proper analysis of that we would see the link. If you really provide housing for very poor, then you have problems to win another elections. If in this, state where there is a very high level of decentralization of power, and most of the decisions are made on local level without state money. So this is just that, and that's all with clear.
Okay, I think Vítek also wants to add
Sorry, just have to react to the comment about the authorship of the results of the study in Brno. It's, I guess, important to say that there's been ongoing academic panel who was overseeing the methodology, the data sets, the interpretation, and also the peer review of the results. So it's not like us doing the results for us with hidden methodology. For example, Professor Jurajda is sitting on this board, and there are others from, 10 different universities, even international universities. So I would not like to reduce the impact or the kind of neutrality of the data of the result. And of course, if you want to see by yourself, it will be available. But I think it's important to say it's really independent and very high quality research. And I don't know if Professor Jurajda want to add something about the process of the.
Right. So I actually am not on the panel. I think somebody like Professor Sokačová is, but I am going to write an opponent's peer review assessment of the. So I am involved in some way.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I keep promising something that I am not delivering on, but we will have one last comment by Linda, and then we will turn to our lovely audience for their comments and questions. So if you want to register your hands, I will, whilst Linda is speaking, I will see who's...
Thank you for your favor. I just want to continue with the political election. I don't want to be like over-optimistic or like happy, because we all know that we have real problems if we regard the social policies connected or targeted on poor people and Roma population or Roma people. But for example, in Ústí nad Labem, there is one significant political force, which is like first or second in the local election, and they were led also by Mr. Karika, who was very active in rapid rehousing of people who lost their shelter in hostel. So I mean, there is many like connections or many factors which influence the political outcome, and I don't want to say that the policies focused on poor people, that these are the most popular in the Czech Republic. It is not like that. And I think that Brno is real case study for the Czech Republic, not only because of the programs. We have also other cities which have very good programs on social housing, but because of the political dynamics before and after the elections. And I think we really should be, or we should follow the progress, what happens, what will not happen, and because we can learn a lot from that. How to do not only from how to do the programs, but how to implement them politically into the municipality structures. And I think Brno is perfect case study for the Czech Republic and maybe for Europe.
Thank you. I'm sure these conversations will continue, if not in the next or after this event, where there will be some refreshments, then indeed at some later point. But now, I've seen the gentleman over there.
So I have a question for Dennis. I like the cost benefit, but I'm wondering what was the incentives, the financial incentives in the program. From what you said, it seems to me most of this is funded from the health budget, so it's like one sector, or it's federal money. Why I'm asking, because here in the Czech Republic we actually do have quite a number of cost effectiveness or cost benefit data. Specifically, I'm working on the field of child protection, so we have lots of data how much community support and social housing is so much cheaper than foster or institutional care. But this data, we've been using it for 8 years, but it simply doesn't work at all, because the municipalities who should provide the housing, they don't care, because they don't pay for the foster care. There's no financial incentive. They don't pay for the institutional care. The social affairs ministry doesn't care. The community support doesn't work, because it will be the education ministry who will pay for the very expensive institution. So zero incentives. So I was wondering, because from what you said, it seems it was kind of some incentives. So I was wondering, what do you think, if there's lack of incentives, what do you do? If there's anything possible to do?
We use the phrase "the wrong pocket problem" to describe what you're saying, which is that the money's in the wrong place and you can't move it from one to the other, because they're different agencies. But the executives of the agencies, the senior ministry people, or I guess the prime minister in this case, and the budget director of the whole government, certainly sees the whole picture and should be able to move money from one place to the other if it's better spent that way. Now, we happen to have but it's been moral persuasion. The cost argument is another moral argument, and it's been advocacy that's persuaded our federal government to say an investment over here is going to make a savings over here, even if they don't do the cost accounting directly on the budget, okay? But we do have a piece of legislation that allows you to credit to one agency cost offsets to another over a 5-year time horizon. But you have to have really good data to show that that exists. But you can, in fact, do that. If I know that spending money on housing is going to reduce health costs, and I can demonstrate that, you are permitted to, it doesn't count as an increase in spending. So The mechanism is there. It has not been used yet. It's been mostly politics.
Okay, Štěpán and
I also have a question for Dennis. During the lectures, you mentioned that quite shortly after your paper on the typology of homelessness, the Bush administration opened a huge program for ending chronic homelessness. I'm interested in how this has happened. So what was the time frame?
It's a very interesting story. Okay, it goes to politics again. In this case, so you may know that there was a tie in our presidential election in 2000, and it went down to Florida to break the tie. And it went to the courts, and so the Bush people hired lawyers and the Gore people hired lawyers. The person in charge of the Bush attack to win was a guy named James Baker. James Baker was the Secretary of State for George Bush I. He was the Chief of Staff and Secretary to Treasury for Ronald Reagan. So he's a long-standing senior Republican, and he led the fight to win the election. So after the election was resolved, within the first 100 days of the Bush administration, James Baker's wife is the founder and the chair of the board of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And she was able to get a meeting with the president in the first 100 days and ask him for this. And he said, how much would it cost? She said $500 million. And he turned to his chief of staff and said, let's find her $500 million. And that's how it happened. Of course, they had the data and statistics to argue it, but they're in the room. You got to get in the room.
Okay, hello. So I really enjoyed the data from the US. So for example, I like the graph from the census that you can look at every 4 years what's the development over time. I wish we could have this for the Czech Republic, of course, being an analytical person myself. So I'm wondering, perhaps I'm addressing mostly representative from Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. What can we do now so that there's more data, better data available in 3 years when there's another census in the Czech Republic? I looked at the data with my colleagues from the most recent census, so that's the first, many of you will know, that's the first that actually included explicitly some homeless people. There are 11,000 people in 2011, according to the census, but it's only people who seek out the services. So it's only, so that there's overlap with some of the data sets that's being discussed. If there's somebody who's not communicating or is not making use of the services or not at the period of the census, then we know nothing about him or her. So I'm just wondering, now might be the time when the Czech Statistical Office is making the decisions how it will deal with homeless people in the next round. So I'm wondering what that could be, a specific effort that we could make to have it included, and then perhaps have it included all of them, or at least try to include all of them, and should that be the beginning of the time series? And then when we look at it from 30 years on, we'll look at so the time series starts in 2021. That's it.
Thank you. Anyone on the panel would like to respond?
It's a difficult question, the census, because we give some comments and suggestions to Czech Statistical Office for a very long time, but what we know about the next census is that it have to be less costly than the previous time. So maybe that's all I can say on this topic right now. So that's the difficulty. And we try to cooperate with Czech Statistical Office. We still try to make them maybe more involved in the housing area, because it's not only about the statistics on homelessness, but we would need more data on housing, data which are collected regularly. So I hope there will be some outcome, but really, according to census, it's like we only know that it should be less costly.
Thank you. Did you want to add to the question?
No.
No.
I forgot to mention the fun fact that there have been 9 PhDs among the homeless people among the 11,000, and you can learn quite a lot from the demographic data there. 40% that divorced and many other interesting extreme statistics.
Okay, thank you. First question here.
Daniel Medic from CERGE-EI idea. A lot of the debate in the panel was on the data and the analysis. First, I will comment on what was said concerning the role of the ministry. The ministry is not only providing comments. It's the government who is giving tasks to the statistical office. Of course, government cannot decide what will be the GDP counts. The statistical office is independent, but at the same time, government provides money to statistical office, decides on how much money they get and what they do for the government. So if the ministry is just providing comments, it's not fully using its powers. The government is simply not using its powers and money it has. And my question related to data analysis, I share opinions of Lesák and Štěpán concerning shortage of data, very problematic access to data and low quality of analysis. At the same time, I'm really convinced that evidence like the one which was presented here from the US would be very helpful in convincing politicians and general public that we are doing something wrong or not doing something at all. And this might be the way to go to reach the consensus he was complaining about. So I don't feel well if you said if academicians want to do some research, they should ask for data somewhere and find some money. I think it should primarily be the ministry who would ask for the research, make the calls, and make the access to data. Otherwise, we will not reach the political consensus, and we will stay in the situation we are.
Unfortunately, I'm not a member of the government, so I can't influence what money will be given for the census. So we have some expert role in this area, and we try the best. And I completely understand that Czech government or the ministry should provide data. We also try to convince the responsible people to be more open when providing data. Maybe we have the same problem as you have when we speak about data, but ministry is not research institution. So we can provide data, we can help how to get the data, but if you consider the system of social services, so we have independent social services providers, and it's really like big request from the civil society in the Czech Republic that we need independent social services providers. So the providers have the data, and maybe I'm wrong, but I read some books on the housing in United States and on research, and I agree that United States have better researches, but they have the same problems with data. But maybe I think they have scholars and researchers who work with the data. For example, I read the book from Matthew Desmond, Evicted, and he writes a little bit also about the problems with data on evictions and housing in the United States. So I agree, the public administration should be more open to provide data and to give them to public. And we also have these problems in our work. But we have also academic institutions and research institutions which do the research work, and unfortunately Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs doesn't have like big money on research. It's like structured in another way. We have to do procurement and
you have institutional funding now, thanks to the R&D Council of the government. That's going to rise in the 3-year forecast to more than 4 times what this institution gets in institutional funding. So you have plenty of funding for research.
Okay, we have research, we have cooperation with many institutions, and I think we can cooperate, and we cooperate with some institution, with some organizations, and then they provide quite good data or the research, and we can do more. But maybe if you would like to have a panel on research, I would suggest prepare new panel and invite people who are responsible for research, because really I do not have all information about how much money we have. We have a special research institution. It's called Výzkumný ústav práce a sociálních věcí, so it's a research institution of social affairs and labor. And they do a research for us, so we can provide some money, but if we regard the procurement conditions, it can be 100,000 per year, then we can do like quite not difficult procurement. But if we want to research for more money, then there are big conditions. It's like that. You can ask our auditors, because we know we had a lot of audits this year on our ministry, so we have the results and we know what we can do. So if it's up to 100,000 crowns, then we have some freedom to do the research or to make some research. But if it's more expensive, then it's much more difficult.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm delighted to hear that the Department for Work and Labour and Social Affairs, has just invited academia and research institutions to join up and maybe form a task force which would look into reforming data, and that's very good news. I think there was one question here from Štěpán, and if that is enough, and if that's all okay, then there will be feedback, and we may be wrapping up in about 10 minutes' time.
So I have a quick question to all panelists, but I would like to start with Martin Lux. You said that we need a law and a duty for municipalities to do social housing. I kind of agree with that. And when I'm thinking about the topic of this panel, what is the way forward in ending homelessness, I think this could help. I can remind your paper from last year that is saying the Social Housing Act is bad, and even the Czech municipalities tell it, and even the Ministry of Regional Development say it. And I would like to understand what's your take on this. So you're critical about the proposal of a law because municipalities aren't happy about it, and now you are saying that the only way or the efficient way how to solve the situation is to impose a duty on municipalities. So what's the way forward in ending homelessness, and should municipalities have legislative duty in securing social housing?
Okay, I will start and the others can add. Firstly, the previous version of the law prepared by Ministry for Social Affairs, the target group was much wider than the target group for the today's law. I mean, even today's law is already finished and there will be no law. But the attempt was to define the target group much more narrowly than was the target group in the first proposal. We worked on that. We created also some methodology how to define the target group for those who should be really allocated by social housing. And we did it intentionally, really, to those who are really very poor, by the definition, who really face discrimination of the market, who really are not helped by other possibilities. These are not seniors, like this was in the first proposal. These are not families, young families. These are really those who do not have any proper housing and have very low income. Then the law has sense. I mean, if you focus on those who really are in very risky position, then the law and duty of municipalities have a sense. Otherwise, if you have very wide target group and you create the law and obligation from the municipality, the only result would be long waiting period. Again, going back to something, to housing system we knew from 1989, before the changes of the regime, when the only possibility was to wait in the queue for 10 years to get some public housing. I never wanted to go back to that period. The only way the law had a sense was to target really to poor people, to very poor people who face the problem. This is the difference. That's why I didn't support the obligations of municipalities for the first proposal, but certainly I did a lot to support the obligation for the second proposal. But we didn't succeed, because the municipality association is very powerful, and despite of the fact that they agreed at the first point with the duty, then they called to Prime Minister and everything changed. That's why I'm very angry on what happened now. But it was promised that the municipalities would agree with the duty under such situation, and then it changed.
As with the previous.
And what's the way forward?
So, what the way forward? Now we know that the only thing that remained is the government program, which is not about law, which is not about obligation. It will be voluntarily. I don't think that it will really help to solution of the homelessness in really significant way. There will be some progress, but definitely not significant. At least I think that it will be not significant. And the way forward is again going back to debate. And well, the government is not only consisted by ANO, but also by Social Democrats. And Social Democrats didn't play any role in it. And they had the law in the program, and they accepted this change. Well, it seems the Social Democrats are quite weak, so why they
Which change? I must to say that our minister Jana Maláčová, so she wants to have, and she didn't agree with the change. We had a big round table on this topic with the Prime Minister, with the Minister Dostálová and Minister Nováková, and our ministry said that she still supports the Act on Affordable Housing, which should consist also of the social housing. So that's her position on this topic, but unfortunately she's not responsible for housing policies in the Czech Republic. So it's not as you say that it's like you agree. You know that we didn't agree with many things in your proposal. We also wasn't sure, we weren't sure, and I'm not sure if your methodology really covers the people in need, because and you don't know that, because this methodology wasn't tested on the target group. So we agreed that we must be like we wanted still. Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs and my colleague, we still want the law on social housing, and we wanted to be like constructive, not to block the discussions, because we have this experience from many organizations, from many ministries from previous time. So we wanted to do the best, I think also with the Agency for Social Inclusion. They had the same aim on this topic. So I'm not sure. I'm sure that the real problem is the obligation. It's not the target group. The target group can be like 5 million people, the target group can be 5,000 people, and the municipalities, but not all municipalities, will oppose, because they oppose the obligation, and not the target groups or financial schemes, because like it's not the most important, I think. So we will see, and we still have these 15 measures which were agreed on the round table at the beginning of September. And next week there will be a working group on these topics. So there were identified for second or third time some measures which could improve the situation in housing, social housing in the Czech Republic, and they are more systematic than only financial support. But it's also important. But I think we need to have more rules to secure, the investments into the future.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry to interrupt. We've run out of time, quite substantially. And there was one last question, wasn't there? What's the way forward? So maybe if we could do a very quick round. I'm not sure whether Dennis will... Well, perhaps, why not? In one sentence, what's the way forward? Thank you.
I think it's a systematic approach and cooperation between public administration.
I'll have a longer sentence. Sorry. You know that we as the Platform for Social Housing are strong advocates for the social housing bill and the obligation of the municipalities. But we are not really relying on this like magic formula, because we can't like wait 10 other years so that the number of homeless people is being reduced. So we are definitely pushing forward also some national well-targeted and well-designed program with municipalities as partners, well-supported, well-funded partners, with very good data framework and based on the results. It has never been implemented in the Czech Republic. We feel that it's really, there is not such a barrier to implement this kind of approach than compared to Social Housing Act. The new ministry can push for it, I think, very well, because we now have the good practices, many cities that are cooperating, but we need this framework, this well-framed design and the data. And I don't think that these 15 measures are even relevant for solving the housing exclusion in Czech Republic. At least 10 of them are really irrelevant, and some of them might be even harmful for the people in housing need. And just last comment, talking about data and data which the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs can provide. We are, as the Platform for Social Housing, connected to other experts in the field. We are preparing a shadow report of the housing exclusion in Czech Republic, because we feel that we have to have the data, and if the government is not able to provide it, we will provide it as the Association of Academics and the NGO sector. We will have the first report done before the end of the year, and we want to do it every year. And we hope that the government and the ministry will get together with us, and the next report will be done maybe together. And just like some fragments, we use the data, for example, now before the election campaign to see how many children there are in the private hostels in Prague, and set the challenge to the candidates for the election parties. Or the other thing is that the government, when preparing the Social Housing Act, say that in the narrow target group we have 65,000 households. But when talking about the precise methodology, we found out that they say actually it's between 60,000 and 16,000. So it's a wide range of, the data is so imprecise even at this level that we can rely on the government, this current government and the Ministry of Regional Development with the data.
Thank you. Thank you, Vítek. I'm not strong in maths, but I think that was more than Martin. Martin, thank you.
I already said that I'd give the word.
Well, the more informed transferring power to the less informed part. A general also would be that until we actually get the centralized data that we ought to be having, because data equals political, influence. When you have data, you can actually talk to the electorate in a more forceful way, and without the data, it's hard to convince people. But until then, when we face these fragmented programs, operation program, this and that, regional, and every city runs its own policy, if among the 15 steps that are proposed is increased funding for municipal organized construction of partly social housing, then at least append that subsidy with the request for data with an eye towards evaluating the different requirements that cities will implement in terms of who gets into these new facilities or new housing capacity that is being built, so that we at least learn something from even fragmented programs.
Okay, and on that note, I shall thank you, all the panelists. Thanks to the audience, and thanks Professor Dennis Culhane for his paper. Thank you very much. And there is refreshments that you can see through the doorway behind your back. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day.